All right. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. It's perfectly fine. And we're going to get into it. We're going to be talking about Scorpio. Scorpio, the ominously loved or hated sign in the zodiac. Scorpio gets the hate that Libra should get, and then that Pisces should get, that really Aries should get, and then maybe what Sag is known for. Either way, um, Scorpio, it's a constant cycle of evolution, and wherever you have it is where you're evolving. We're going to talk about that. So, accessing your chart using AstroSeek, here we are. We're talking about Scorpio. We're going to be talking about Pluto and Mars together and how they interact to create Scorpio. The difference between Mars and Pluto in a way, and also we're going to be talking about the eighth house. So to be a Scorpio, you were born on the 23rd of October or the 21st of November. You're not a Scorpio Libra cusp. You're either a Scorpio or a Libra. You might have the sun sign and then have a lot of planets in one or the other that give you a stellium, but you're not one or the other. You're either one or the other. You're not just a cusp. So there's that. Now, Pluto is seen as the modern ruler of Scorpio, but the traditional sense is Mars. I use both because I do think there is something to add with the two of them together to give you the Scorpion, the most intense, ambitious, loyal, resourceful, and resilient person that you can find. Kind of very scary. But let's talk about the positive traits. So obviously we know that Scorpios are passionate, they're very deep, and everything that they do, because it's very much a one-to-one type of thing. Scorpio is the next sign after Libra on the descendant, so it's very much about me and my connections with other. It's in the third quadrant of the zodiac, and therefore, because it's in that quadrant, it's very much about the depth that you can go with one to one with a person. And to talk about loyalty with Scorpios is very much about talking about whether or not someone is really connected to an idea of what they think someone is. And that's very big. Now, having some Scorpio placements myself, I think I'm qualified enough to talk about this. Scorpios don't judge you for what you do, they judge you for who you are. And that is where the betrayal comes from. You could be a fraud, you could be a criminal. I'm not saying they're going to support horrible people, but you can be many things and they will be okay with that as long as you're that thing and you are it proudly. The betrayal comes from being one thing to someone and faking it to another, or not just owning up to this personality of whatever it is that you really are. That is a really big part of the disloyalty that Scorpios kind of get bothered over. It has nothing to do if you do something good or bad. Not saying that Scorpio is going to like tolerate bad actions, but that's very important to remember. And their ability to come back is really just a constant shedding cycle that Pluto really lays on them, right? Now, some of the negative aspects is that Scorpios can become very attached and possessive. And it's not just a sense of jealousy, but it's just because they're really wanting to connect with another person. They're really wanting to be with the other. Something interesting to keep in mind, and I'm going to pull this up on the chart because we're going to make this really interactive today for this lesson. But when we look at where Scorpio is, let's go back here. On the chart, if we just look at Scorpio and we think about its position, you really want to notice that it's in the eighth house. Let's go ahead and just do the sun. Here, it looks like, there we go. So we just have the sun. All right, so what do we see in the sun? Let me actually add some colors because I know my black and white can be a little dull. And there we go. So Venus is the opposite of Scorpio, meaning Taurus, right? Why is that? So Venus here ruling Taurus, Mars over here ruling Scorpio, right? They're opposites. Venus is your sense of value and who you are and the things that you love. I covered that when we went over Libra. But Scorpio is all about your action, drive, willpower. And so the reason why it's important to realize the possession is that Mars here is trying to capture Venus. Mars is trying to say, "You are mine, I am yours." It's the ultimate Romeo and Juliet story between these two. So when you have places in that eighth house, you really want to look at that second house and see what's in there, what sign is in there, even if it's not Scorpio and Taurus like this in a Aries generic rising. Not that generic's bad, but so that you can really know what's the connection here. What is it that you're very possessive over? Because Scorpio really is like Hades here, where it's like, you give to me, you give your tides forever. You're never leaving. And that's where you can kind of see this overly attachment to another. Now, the secretiveness, I think that's really something that is also misunderstood. Scorpio definitely has to deal with a lot of problems on its own. So it's like, why also add other people? Typically, having that Scorpio placement, whether it's Sun or Mercury, or wherever the house of Scorpio is, it's like people constantly wanting to know. And then I notice that the Scorpio person doesn't have any interest to share. It's actually funny because even if it's a full Leo stellium of a person that really wants everyone to share, to know, to be in their business, the one house where they have Scorpio, not a peep. Like, not a peep. You'll never know. You'll never hear about it. And I think that's a really good example that I like to pull out because if the most sharing person can have a very intimate secret part of themselves, that kind of lets you understand Scorpio a lot more. The vengeful nature is really just an eye for an eye. Like that's the most simplest way to know about it. And it's like the way that if you upset a Cancer, which is a also familiar water sign, they'll come back and be in that emotion unless you give them a hug or something. But with Scorpio, they will genuinely be above the emotion of how you made them feel, but how they refuse to let you make them feel in the future. That's the sense of vengefulness that I typically see. And then that obviously over time it can grow a lot, especially in the dark. So, talking about Scorpio, let's actually talk about the modern ruler, which is Pluto. This is debated kind of. I'm just here to make sure I can help someone understand themselves, so I don't really pitch too much of a tent between like Mars and Pluto the same way like is Mercury exalted in Aquarius or Virgo or whatever, like that's fine. They all have their purpose. So Pluto here is the depth in Scorpio. And this is something that I really want to drive home. When I think of Scorpio and you think of a large body of water, there's layers to how much light can penetrate. So let's say we draw a large body of water and we're looking at this on the 2D, right? Now let's say we create a 3D representation of this large body of water, right? And I don't know why my large body of water is becoming a cube, but I guess that's the only way I can represent the 3D interface of this large body of water. The 3D, the depth, this is Pluto. Because as you get darker, sorry, as you get deeper and you pierce more and more into the depth, the darkness of what is visible increases. And that's a really good way of looking at Pluto. The Mars, to me, with Scorpio, is just the fact that there is limitless water around. right? It's the fact that this can span for miles, but the depth there doesn't actually last. And that's a really good example of like Aries versus like Scorpio. I always like saying Scorpio's that sniper rifle, Aries is the minigun, because it's like one shot, one kill. I want to make sure the job is done. Aries is like, hey, if I get enough bullets in you, you'll probably die. And that's the difference there. You know, the profoundness of how deep someone goes, that Scorpio nature is what really attracts people to Scorpio. Because it's like, what do you mean you're going to devote your whole life to this person or this idea or this craft? What do you mean you're going to devote hours upon hours to get revenge? That's the depth of Pluto. It's obsessive, it's kind of unhealthy, but it is this cycle and it's very profound. Now, Pluto is also the subconscious power dynamics. This would be where Pluto is seen as a generational planet. And whenever I do psychological astrology, I look at that collective unconscious energy coming out. Where if Pluto is in a sign like it's been in Capricorn, the collective unconscious is very focused on the materialistic needs of structure and hierarchy. The older brother of Saturn, Capricorn, being like, hey, listen to me when I speak, do what I say, or no money for you. Now, Pluto is so much more than that, but we've been in Capricorn as Pluto for so long we kind of forgot that. And Pluto in Aquarius is really going to show us that like Pluto is really about digging up that dirt and it doesn't care about anything else. Whatever it like dresses up as is really the sign that it's in because Pluto is definitely going to make sure it creates a crisis. It will always do that, regardless of what it is. We had the '08 financial crisis for Pluto in um, Capricorn, and in every Pluto before that, we've had a big thing that's relating to that Pluto. And we'll have a most likely crisis point with Aquarius. It's just what it does, because in order for something to grow, in order to have a harvest, seeds have to be planted. And before the seeds get planted, the harvest had to get plucked. It was either fruitful harvest or it was withering crops, but something had to get removed in order to do that cycle, as is most things. So, as I said with Mars, it doesn't have that depth, but it does have stamina in a sense. I do believe Pluto is still longevity, but Mars is what's going to get you up to go, or else Pluto would just sit there and really not really do anything. And I can sometimes see a very Mars driven Scorpio versus a very Pluto driven Scorpio. I really think the Pluto driven is like more cathartic mentally and self destructive. The Mars driven actually has effects onto people. And I think a really good representation of that is like a very clustered mercurial Scorpio energy, where it's like really deep thoughts about, well, things, I guess I would say. I'm not going to get into that. But the Mars driven Scorpio that does have some fire with it really will get things going, especially if it's Aries, Scorpio, Leo, Scorpio, Sag, Scorpio, the generic. But yeah, the willpower is really just from refusing to be defeated. Imagine if you have the idea that Mars is exalted in Capricorn, but the Capricorn wants to win and be the best. The Scorpio just wants to make sure it gets it done. It wants to make sure the killing blow is there. It wants to make sure the precision, the passion, and it doesn't, I know I'm using dark analogies, but it really could just be something as simple as like artistry, wanting to be the very best you can be for yourself. And I love seeing Mars in Scorpio for this reason because it colors the rest of the chart in a way where it's like, wow, you're really good at this thing. And people don't realize you're not trying to compete with anyone else. You're just competing with yourself. And it's like a slight mix of perfectionism, mixed with like, it's not enough, mixed with like, we need to overcome this and no one can tell me no. And because of this, we do really see a really nice flavor of Mars when it is desiring something. Because, like I said, it opposes Venus in that way. And that's a trait of the polarity where when it desires that love for the passion that it has for something, it goes absolutely after it. Mars will definitely do that because it's going to go towards Venus. And that's why, if you think about it, Venus is seen as the darkness, right? I think that's like, is that? I always mix yin and yang, but the black and the yin and yang. And if you just think about this conceptually, if Venus is like, or feminine energy is where intelligence comes from, and intuitively, if Scorpio is moving towards that and it wants to be in the dark, it's really Mars wanting to be in the energy of Venus because it's in the dark. And so Venus is always attracting to it. And this is like something you could think of in manifesting. You don't really work hard to manifest. You desire something, and then the energy of what would be Scorpio or masculine makes you go do the action for it. The working hard isn't just working hard for it, but you're using both together. And so it's like a beautiful energetic exchange that gives you a result that you want, or if that would be your manifestation. You can't have one without the other, and I see that as something that, I should probably mention when people tell you just write affirmations or just work hard. Like it has to be together because that's how Venus and Mars or as above, so below, plus minus, all that polarity stuff. But that's really what gives Mars that passion because it has a desire for something. But yeah, so how do we bring them together? Kind of beating a horse, whatever that saying is, but the passion and the drive of Mars and the transformation of Pluto gives you Scorpio. And because of this drive, I think that Scorpio is one of the coolest signs for this, right? Every sign obviously has this one thing, but it's like to have a Scorpio placement is really to be a lifelong learner in that aspect, right? The depth that you get from Pluto, the pain, the suffering, the cathartic, unnecessary, like unplugging of your emotions that Mars wants to be in something can be very difficult, but it's like it's very connected in that way. And that's where I want to talk about the intimacy of the both of them. I know that it's very much seen that Mars specifically is very going, like Mars is going to be that masculine energy that's going to go for whatever it's desiring of Scorpio, and that's where the sexual drive may be seen. But Pluto really comes there and it makes the sexual aspect psychological. I don't know how much of this I have to censor for YouTube, but it's not just physical, right? And that's something you can think about an Aries Venus versus a Scorpio Venus, or Mars, where it's like Aries versus Scorpio. Because Pluto rules psychology and how we think as a collective, you have to understand that Pluto is also going to look at power dynamics in relationship, but even in intimacy, psychologically aligning yourself with the other person is what makes that Scorpio placement in intimacy so deep. It's because it's one thing to just be attracted to someone, which is very Mars, and another thing to desire someone more than just the Mars energy, but psychologically attaching yourself to them to a point where it's like, wow, I can't think the same without being with this person or this thing. And that's what makes Pluto have the depth of obsession in Scorpio. So bringing that together, you have the guy from Yes, or whatever his name was, the triple Scorpio guy, or no, from You. That's what it's called, the TV show You. That guy, it's funny, the actual actor has a bunch of Scorpio placements, but it's like the way that he transversed his whole life to know about someone. That psychological knowing is the Pluto enacting itself as the Scorpio placements. The willingness to go and doing crazy, shady things for that person is the Mars. And you get to see one clock in, one clock out, because it's planning, it's perusing. It's very much people watching, honestly. It's very observatory. Pluto is very observatory in that sense. And then it causes the chaos. And I already talked about the depth, so I'm not actually going to dig too much into that. But we'll jump into the housing systems. We are about 20 minutes in. Do want to remind you guys, if you have questions, feel free to ask. And, of course, we will take a break in a little bit, but I wanted to get through this before we go over like chart examples and you guys have other stuff that you usually ask me. But the housing system, so if you have an Aries rising, obviously Scorpio is going to be in the eighth. And we talked about how the eighth opposes the second. And you want to look at where your second house is and what's in that house. You know, we're going to get into it some more by like the ruler of your Mars, right? If your Mars is Libra, so now you have an inverted Mars and Venus because the ruler of Libra is Venus, but your Mars is there. So it's like, how does that relationship play out where Mars and Venus is in your chart? Because that will affect how Pluto plays out with that Scorpio energy. And stuff like that is really what gives you a next level of astrology. If, for instance, we have this Capricorn rising chart where Scorpio's in the 11th, the whole idea of friendships and community is where that psychological Pluto takes place. So now when I look at that, it's like, wow, Mars and Venus are right next to each other here. And so you have a person who's very much looked at as someone who has to be perfect because they will try to hide this Scorpio. They lose a lot of friends. They have a lot of jealous and envious people in their lives. But if you look, like they, in a way, kind of don't get to fully be the center of attention because they're going to have to make a sacrifice with the Scorpio there. And then they will always try to live up to some sort of standard from home because the 10th house has Mars in it or Aries. And so they try to make up for their lack thereof in the social political atmosphere because they have to hide this Scorpio placement. And so understanding where Scorpio is, looking at where Libra and Taurus is at, you can really get a sense of like, wow, this is something that affects those three houses especially together. And then you look at what the rising is to know how that all plays out. It's really intricate. But let's dive into that eighth house. So we know that it's going to have the themes of Scorpio because that is where Scorpio would want to be. It's going to have death, rebirth, transformation, and all that. It's going to have power, control, manipulation, but it's really Pluto there, right? Power dynamics and are you dangerous to me or are you not? The idea of the scorpion and the stinger is like, do I have to use it or do I not? Right? What is it that we see eye to eye on and what is it that we do not? Right? The eighth house is also shared resources. One after Libra being like after you get married, how does the money get divided? Or after you start the company, typically I'm assuming with the company you want to know it before, but once we start the company and the money is actually coming in, like where is it going? That's how you can also think of that eighth house. In Jyotish or Vedic astrology, it's almost the same thing, but they really look at that eighth house as pain and suffering. And I do agree in some sense because there's a sacrifice. Mars is always sacrificing for Venus. And so when you have Scorpio and Venus, you sacrifice love to get peace because everything else is accessible. Like you have everything else but love. But in order to get that love, you're looking for peace because Venus is there. Where else, if it was just Mars, being anywhere, if it was Scorpio being anywhere else, you would sacrifice that thing to get your sense of love. And so it's very much about what it is that brings you that happiness. There is deep sexual intimacy, and that's really because of Pluto there. I really like to say that fifth house is really the sex, and like eighth house is just like maybe the kink, but even more so like the thing that in that atmosphere you feel okay and vulnerable to like share with someone. The actual action of it is usually the fifth house. Now, the unconscious hidden part, that's all to me kind of just like Pluto saying, "Hey, like I'm I'm really interested in knowing how caterpillars develop, and I really want to take that into like, I don't know, make it a TED Talk." Like that's where I look at some of the house secret stuff where it's like it doesn't have to be something crazy. And I feel like Scorpio is over sexualized because Silence is attractive. And Scorpio runs on silence because it doesn't want to be perceived because it's psychologically people watching 24/7 to see where the next danger is coming. So that energy is attractive. There's this idea that in order to, not even an idea, but it's true, in order to gain more chi, you don't move, you meditate. Objects that are slow are more attractive. Things that don't change often are reliable. But when you have that in a person, I look at it and I think that's the person that when they walk in the room and they're silent, there's a sense of attraction. It could be curiosity. It doesn't mean you have to immediately like them or find them like sexually attractive, but it really is like, what is that? I want to know what that is. Um, and that's something that definitely to keep in mind with that. So death and afterlife, I don't think I want to go into the death part and doing that, but you can use the eighth house for a lot of things, looking at how I'd rather just say looking at it to see what is the thing that will be a cycle. Whatever planets you have in that eighth house, it's definitely something to keep in mind that Pluto's affecting that. And so there's a constant psychological analysis that goes down with that. And I'll say that to be a way to perceive death. Transforming through the crisis, which would be the death, and then looking at a phoenix rising from the ashes. Because Scorpio goes from the Scorpio, the lowest tier, I like to say, like maybe just root chakra, and then the eagle would be like, in my opinion, the heart chakra, what really you need, and then the crown would be the phoenix, because it's like after the third eye of seeing, you understand and you can go back down because you realize like you should need to go up and down. You can't just stay up there or you're detached. You can't stay down here or you'll never be able to see anything above the grass, you know. And so you need to be able to be flexible. And Pluto will definitely move you from being a little bit inflexible when you get comfortable somewhere. No one defeats Pluto. So, yeah. And of course, being very scorpionic, you're going to be drawn to the occult and the mysticism just because societally that's taboo. I really feel like if it was more open to be that, Scorpio people would probably just end up being Christians or something. They'd probably go to some sort of religion, and that'd be a really big part of it. So I'm going to pause here before we actually go through anything else, and I'm going to give you guys about 5 minute break to be able to take all that in. And yeah, let's go ahead and continue. Let's talk about the planetary dignities of Scorpio. So the domicile, once again, is essentially the most comfortable place the planet gets to be. It actually works really well with the energy that it is. The detriment is where it would prefer not to be. It's a little bit of a challenge there to express itself. Exaltation is the best place that it wants to be. Very, very easy to express itself there. And then the fall is where it doesn't have the best control. Now, as I always have a disclaimer, having a fallen, a detrimental exaltation or domicile on a planet isn't necessarily a good thing, especially if the rest of your chart doesn't synergize well with it. It can actually be bad, too much of one thing than the other. So when we look at Scorpio, it's actually really simple. So I put Pluto and Mars as a domicile of Scorpio. So you were either born in the millennial generation, I have Pluto and Scorpio, or you have Mars in Scorpio. Now, that's about it for Scorpio. When you look at the detriment, it's Venus. And if you think about that, it's just because, like I said, you have to sacrifice love. And that Venus really doesn't get a sense of like acceptance. It doesn't really get to be taken care of. And that Venus in Scorpio is just, well, it's tragic. It's really, really tragic. Um, because it's such a loving, caring person that wants a very connected person with them to go through life, but then they're sacrificing love every single time. And so, what I've always told whenever I do readings for clients that do have that Venus in Scorpio, I'm like, just get a +1 bestie for life. Make a really good friend and never try to date them. And then you're fine. And then literally life becomes so much easier. And I've literally seen it in action. Clients of mine who have made friends or girlfriends who are just like there, or guy friends who are just like, that's basically their partner, but they're not dating them. And it lets that Venus in Scorpio breathe. It really gives it a chance, right? Because that Venus and Scorpio, or a Venus of a placement in the eighth house, or a Venus in the second house, even Venus is rising with Scorpio there. It's just like it needs to give itself unequivocally to one person. It just needs that so badly. And if that doesn't happen, it ends up trying to fix things in people and it becomes very um, damaged in that way. But so Mars is exalted in Capricorn. I didn't add that in because it's Capricorn. I really wanted to focus on Scorpio, and the exaltation really isn't seen in Scorpio. It's like, there's no really good place to have this chaos. But I still wanted to just drop that in because I think that Scorpio is a little bit too emotional for Mars at times. And being in Capricorn is just the right amount of cold to be like, I actually don't emotionally care anymore and walk away without trying to get a revenge. So the fall is the moon. Now, the moon in Scorpio is honestly like I have so much empathy for it because it's hard. It's hard. The moon wants to be free. It wants to be light. It wants to be able to move around. And to be in Scorpio is hell. It's just being rooted to something that needs way too much energy and attention and time. And it's like, why can't I just be free? You know, it's very much it's difficult. When I think of Scorpio moons, I look at them and I'm like, I just want you to be able to be a Libra moon for a day. Like I just wish you knew what that felt like because they truly should be able to be free, but they genuinely see so many things that they just can't let go. And they always go through cycles of deep connection and eventual self-destruction. Um, but they're such good people. They fight for the will of others because they truly want to have radical change. That moon in Scorpio is almost like just being an Aquarius in a way. It just has no ability to emotionally detach. And that's probably the biggest thing. So, we've come to the end of this learning session. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.